Good morning, folks, and welcome to the Palliative Care Friday Chalk Talks. Today, we are joined by an outstanding guest to share some of his career wisdom and to touch on 4 of his recent salient publications. We have Dr. Harvey Chochinov. He is a distinguished professor of psychiatry at the University of Manitoba in Winnipeg, Canada, and a senior scientist at Cancer Care Manitoba, where much of his research is focused on palliative care and exploring ways of humanizing the experience of healthcare. Harvey's research has contributed to changing the way people deliver palliative care around the world, has helped grow an awareness of the human side of medicine, and has emphasized dignity and personhood, particularly when people are grappling with life-limiting conditions. Harvey has shared with me how proud he is of being Canadian, and in 2015, he was appointed an officer in the Order of Canada. And lastly, one fun fact that most people may not know is that he's a half-decent musician and played guitar and violin in a wedding bar mitzvah band to support his schooling. So welcome, Harvey.
Thanks, Marty. Appreciate it.
Absolutely. So our format for today is 2 parts. Got a short interview kind of targeting about 20 minutes, focusing on the 4 papers that I sent out to you folks. And then we'll save a few minutes at the end for some questions from the audience. So we'll start with your why. Share a little bit of your story, your why, how personally and professionally you decided as a psychiatrist to pursue an interest in so many different palliative care subjects.
Well, I mean, that's always a difficult question because, I mean, there's certainly, I mean, everybody has a personal story. And, you know, we all have things that bring us into this work, and you know, I'm no different than anyone else in that regard. You know, I've had you know, personal experiences, clinical experiences that have kind of led me down this path. But I think kind of more telling, I suppose, I think sort of a more direct linkage is that when I started doing psychiatry and became interested in the interface between psychiatry and cancer, as I mentioned, I went off to Memorial Sloan Kettering. I did a fellowship with folks like Jimmy Holland, who was a pioneer in palliative care or in psycho-oncology, people like Kathleen Foley, a world-renowned pain specialist. But when I came back to Winnipeg, I remember I attended a journal club, probably, you know, not unlike the kind of thing we're doing this morning, sitting around and talking about articles. And one of the articles we talked about one day was an article that had been published by a colleague of mine named James Brown. He was a mood disorder specialist. And it was the first article, it had been published in the American Journal of Psychiatry, to broach the topic as to whether patients near the end of life desire an early death. It wasn't about euthanasia or assisted suicide per se. I mean, this was decades before any change in legislation in Canada. But it was really that article and looking at it saying, you know, James Brown seems to be saying that everybody in this small study, everybody in this cohort who has a desire to die, wishes life to be over sooner, has a syndromal depression or clinical depression. We said, well, that's interesting, but it doesn't sound entirely plausible that it is the only explanation. And it was really, I mean, that was one of the most formative studies. I mean, there are a couple of others, and you know, that we might mention in our conversation, but that was certainly one of the formative studies that really changed the trajectory of my life, and certainly was the first study that engaged me in the possibility of doing empirical research in this area. So that study shifted me to saying, let's look at this more in depth. And our first studies that came out in the, you know, mid 1990s were looking at things like desire for death in the terminally ill, identifying syndromal depression, looking at ways of screening for depression in the terminally ill. And I found that the research space was just one that continued to be intriguing and one that I continue to be engaged with, I mean, to this very day. So that's, I think, a very truncated, abbreviated version of my why.
Lovely. Thank you. So many of your papers talk about wisdom and growth. Can you tell us about something in the field of medicine that you look back at now that you've grown, and how you feel differently about some of those things today?
Um, I perhaps the and again, I don't know that it's that I was unaware of these things, but I think as time has passed and I've had more chance to think about them and to study them, that they now sit with me with a degree of solidity that perhaps wasn't as firm. So and I'm thinking about all the work that we've done on dignity, on personhood, on the importance of recognizing the individual who also happens to embody these various different ailments that we see them for. A number of years ago, I wrote a paper called "The Secret Is Out: Patients Are People with Feelings That Matter." And I mean, even though it sounds like a ridiculous title for a paper, there's real wisdom in understanding that and being able to say to people that I now teach and lecture, that we are dealing with human beings. I mean, we are flesh and blood. If we were, working in the automobile industry, steel, aluminum, I mean, those materials don't have feelings. We're not going to put a developing car out by the fact that we weren't particularly sensitive. But when it comes to providing medical care, and again, I mean, we've done studies, there's good evidence to show that if you aren't attentive to this human side of medicine, it's bad for patients, it's bad for their families, and it's bad for healthcare providers. I mean, we have evidence that when healthcare providers start to disengage from the emotional dimension of patient experience, they're much more vulnerable to professional burnout. In fact, that is one of the symptoms of burnout, is people becoming disengaged. And we have data that shows that when people are more able to engage in the issues related to personhood, they in fact, rather than showing heightened vulnerability, what they actually show is a heightened degree of job satisfaction. So again, it sounds like such a small and pithy thing to settle on, but I think over time, just having a very firm footing in this notion that patients are people, and people do have feelings that matter, and we need to find ways of acknowledging that and being attentive to that. And that is not only a good way of delivering medicine, it's also cost effective in that it avoids us from facing litigation, patients who are unhappy, discordance around goals of care. And if our data around professional burnout is accurate, it also ensures that our healthcare providers are going to be healthier by maintaining some kind of engagement with the human side of medicine.
Yeah, it's a win-win-win. Though I wonder if in a couple of decades we'll be making the same argument for the steel and aluminum of artificial intelligence and their feelings, but we'll cross that bridge when we get there.
Well, you're actually speaking to an avatar. I'm on vacation somewhere.
Sure. So, in praise of wisdom, you hinted that the inspiration for this piece really was the challenge in the national discussions involving smart versus wisdom in medical assistance in dying. And so, can you share a little bit more detail on sort of where that conversation is headed these days?
Yeah, well, you told me you're planning on posting this, so that's going to perhaps influence
Yeah.
how forthcoming I am.
I can edit out something if you'd like to.
No. Look, I mean, I think everyone in the world, and certainly our neighbors to the south, I think are very aware of what's been happening in Canada with respect to issues related to medical assistance in dying, which is the euphemism that's being used to describe euthanasia and assisted suicide. We have legislation that came into effect in 2016. We had an amended legislation that came into effect in 2021, which said that the prior legislation that limited availability of MAID for patients whose death was reasonably foreseeable was unconstitutional and unfair, and therefore we dropped the reasonably foreseeable death provision. And so there's been this incredible embracing and expansion of death hastening measures and practices. And that article was really written after I appeared as a witness. There was a special committee comprised of parliamentarians, members of parliament, and members of the Senate, who allegedly were supposed to be doing an unbiased, objective review of issues so they could inform, legislative reform. They heard from, hundreds of witnesses. And to be frank, I think they did Canadians a disservice in that there was a great deal of bias. There were people who seemed to be more intent on speaking their mind and kind of putting forward their own attitudes and ideas about these things, as opposed to the wisdom of listening to people from various different camps and trying to really absorb what was being said, so they might be able to distill that information and deliver something that could be, as I say, objective, unbiased, thoughtful. And so I found it, just a very unsatisfactory process, and I was one of those witnesses. And I also try to watch as much of the testimony, and it's all online if people are interested in watching it. I thought it was really unfortunate that we had a parliamentary committee that conducted themselves in a way that I think is antithetical to the development of good, well-informed public policy. So that's where the inspiration for that piece came from.
Thank you for sharing.
And you can put it online, and I'll stand by it.
Sounds fair. Sounds fair. So I think it is interesting.
I've written the committee myself and told them as much.
That sounds fair. That sounds fair. Our next question, I think is interesting because I think it is typical for someone in palliative care to read your Platinum Rule paper and jump to the topic of futility. And so how do you reconcile the Platinum Rule when a patient's really requesting treatment that, at least from our vantage point, is viewed as not medically indicated or potentially futile, whatever that word means, especially in cases where the medical team is feeling that moral distress about providing that care?
For sure. So listen, although it has the word rule, I mean, the fact is that, any of these approaches, have limitations, as does the golden rule, as I pointed out in the article, in that it does mean that we are imposing this external standard. We are saying that, we are the infallible barometer of what patients might want. In the paper, and there are now two papers on the Platinum Rule. One was published in the Journal of Palliative Medicine in June of 22, and one was published in JAMA Neurology in November of 22. What's interesting, and I will answer your question, but what's interesting, just in terms of knowledge translation, is that by March of 23, Scientific American actually did an editorial on the Platinum Rule saying this is a new standard of patient-centered care that we should be, or person-centered care that we need to be at least looking at and trying to understand. The article, though, does say, if you read the article in the Journal of Palliative Medicine, that this does not mean that all people get all things all time. Because, of course, that's completely untenable. There are some people who are going to be kind of driven by kind of a depressive, nihilistic stance and say, I deserve nothing, I want nothing, leave me alone. And there are going to be other people who are going to be kind of driven by a sense of grandiose entitlement that has no basis in reality. Okay, so we need to understand that. But I say that even if that's the case, it is important that we get a handle on why does somebody take that position? What's going on with them? So it is not meant to create this kind of toxic, unfettered autonomy. What
Uh-huh.
it is meant to do is to say, we all have bias. And that's not because we are bad people, it's because we are human. And we better acknowledge that bias and be aware of it. Because as long as we don't, we are not going to be sensitive to the fact that the lens that we look through has been tainted and shaped by the way in which we have been raised, the way in which we've been socialized. So I think even though, of course, it's easy to be critical of the Platinum Rule for the very reasons you point out. I mean, is this about unfettered autonomy? I think the essence of the Platinum Rule is we need to look at issues related to bias so that we can be engaged in practices that are valuing the whole issues around equity, diversity, and inclusiveness.
And it fosters curiosity. That was the main theme that I felt like I got out of it. The curiosity to appreciate the other person's perspective, starting at the why.
And also with
Mm.
respect to palliative care and substitute decision making, we all know
Mm.
that if we are sitting at the bedside of somebody who is no longer able to voice their wishes,
Mm-hmm.
the correct question is
Mm-hmm.
not a golden rule question. Well, what
Mm.
would you want us to do?
Yeah.
Correct question is invoking a platinum standard, which is to say, if we could bring your mom or dad back the way they were a month ago or 2 months ago, what is it that they would want? So it's saying the perspective that we are taking is one that is patient or person centered, not centered on we, the external evaluator.
Sure. All right. A lovely article of yours published in Canada's national newsletter, The Globe, Mail. It was called Depression is a Liar. Can you tell us a little bit about this?
Oh, um,
Wow, heavy sigh.
well, depression is a monster.
Yeah.
I mean, depression is a horrible affliction, and part of the affliction of depression is that it changes the perception of the person who is suffering to a place where they feel like they're not doing good enough. In fact, they are failing. They're inadequate. Anything they do, anything they think, if it comes from them, it must be bad. And I mean, in psychiatry, we use fancy language talking about cognitive distortions and this cognitive triad of hopelessness and hope for themselves, their circumstances, the future. But from the individual experiencing this, what they're struggling with is that depression is a liar. Depression is telling them, despite whatever external evidence, you're no good. You're not worthwhile. And that is the tragedy of depression and kind of feelings of self-deprecation and even self-destruction. I mean, we destroy what we can no longer tolerate. I think the article tries to. I mean, towards the end of the article, I think what it tries to do is to let people know that the truth is, and I say depression doesn't want you to hear this, but that the truth is not that you were failing, but the truth is that this is happening because you are human. And by the way, depression creates a series of unrealistic expectations, so that it says, I should have been able to do something better. And I even present evidence to show that trauma is highly associated with suicidality. Now, when you are traumatized, I mean, oftentimes people who are traumatized feel like I should have been able to defend myself, or I should have been able to avert tragedy. There's even data that I quote that says people who are witnesses to trauma are more likely to become suicidal. Well, what's that about? It's this kind of a fantasy that even, or maybe it's the realization that even my horror, even my revulsion couldn't prevent, what happened. And so depression says, you should have been able to, even though we know as humans we could not. So the article really tries to conclude by saying the reason that depression is so powerful is because it's whispering these falsehoods into your ear. And the truth is, the reason that you're feeling this way is not because you were bad or flawed, it's because you're human. And we are all human. And if in our brokenness, we can experience our humanity, then that gives us the opportunity for healing, with the realization that none of us are invulnerable. I mean, all of us none of us get out of this hole. I mean, all of us carry around scars. And that again is part of being human. So the heavy sigh is that it's a difficult topic, and it's trying to appeal to people who are, whose lives who have found themselves kind of kidnapped by this psychological monster, and are being held captive. And what can we do to try and help them break out of that captivity and reclaim their lives?
Yeah. I have one more question, but I want to let the audience know that after this, we'll open it up to them. So if you guys want to use the raise hand function, that would probably be the easiest for me, and then I'll call on you. Harvey, you just published a piece in the Journal of Clinical Oncology on intensive caring that is getting a little bit of buzz. Can you tell us a little bit about it?
Yeah, well, this has been it's been a really interesting piece to contemplate and to write, and now to see the reception. So I mean, the inspiration for intensive caring, as I have documented in the article, is Dame Cicely Saunders, and her famous adage that you matter because you are you, and you matter to the end of your life. And by the way, I just recently gave the Cicely Saunders International Annual Lectureship, and so I was able to go to London. It kind of felt like this full circle moment, because I met Dame Cicely many years ago. In fact, I began the lecture with a photograph that was taken of the two of us at her desk in 1999. But I started thinking about this adage that really has become the kind of philosophical tenet of the central philosophical tenet of palliative care, with the realization that although she said it, what she didn't say is, how do we operationalize that? In other words, how can we help people feel that they matter when they feel that they're feeling hopeless and they're feeling everything is futile? And as I remember one patient saying to me, breathing has become redundant. And so intensive care is an approach that we use for people who are in these, incredible physical dire straits. But what about an approach that attends to people who are feeling like they don't matter, feeling hopeless, helpless, worthless? And the article really tries to take largely work that I've done over the last 30 years, to say, here are the elements of intensive caring. These are the components of intensive caring. And one of the things that it also does, and again, this is a very brief sort of thumbnail synopsis, but one of the things that it tries to do is it tries to look at replacing what is sort of the typical medical paradigm of examine, diagnose, and fix, with a different paradigm that allows us to maintain our presence with patients. I mean, if we feel that anything that is, because the truth is, I mean, we encounter, and I'm speaking to the choir here, we encounter lots of things that don't lend themselves well to being fixed. We deal with most of the things that we deal with, I would even say, are beyond fixable. If the medical paradigm that we work in is based on the notion of examining, diagnosing, and fixing, then it only leaves us with the option of either remaining present and feeling impotent and futile, or abandoning the patient, saying, this is not in my, this is not in my lane, and so we exit. So intensive caring says we need to have a paradigm that allows us a way of being with patients in spite of the fact that we're not able to fix them. And so examination segues to, knowing who the person is. Uh, Diagnosis segues to understanding the nature of their suffering, and fixing segues to find ways of being with, find ways of comforting. And so, that is a sort of a thumbnail kind of presentation of intensive caring. As you say, I mean, the reception has been really quite extraordinary. There have been, I think at this point, close to 7,000 downloads from the JCO website. But as well, I've been getting some really interesting correspondence from people who are dealing with things that I hadn't necessarily contemplated at the time I wrote it. For example, parents of children who are born with significant disabilities, and talking about the fact that they see this approach as being a way of valuing that person, rather than being stuck in this sort of paradigm of how do we fix,
Sure.
how do we value, how do we be with, in a way that provides people a sense of affirmation.
That's lovely. Well, we'll open it up if the audience has got any questions. We're giving people a moment to stew. Think. When I read that paper, it reminded me of a hospice case I had in fellowship when I was in Iowa, where I'd met a lady who had lots of feelings of hopelessness. She had no family, no sense of purpose. The only thing she lived for in hospice was to sit on her porch and smoke. And I felt I felt hopeless as to what I was going to do to fix how she was feeling. And even though I saw her pretty frequently, all we did was just sit on the porch, and I just sat there while she smoked. And maybe that was actually the solution all along. But
and the word that I would underscore in what you just said is the word just.
Just.
There's this feeling like that can't possibly be enough.
Yeah.
We're talking to a family friend. He was saying, he was feeling so sad because he would go visit his wife who's in a personal care home. She's got dementia. She's on pureed food, and he say, all I do is just sit with her and hold her hand for a few hours in the day. I said, Len, are you friggin' kidding me? What do you mean just? I mean, do you think anybody on this earth can do something more profound than reminding your wife for those few hours that somebody cares? Somebody, whatever ability she has to sense that is what you are doing. And there's no just in that.
Reminds me of all the patients that once somebody enrolls in hospice or comfort focus, people start peeling away and disappearing from the bedside, and how they must feel. But we are just about at time. We have just a minute left of you, Harvey. All right. Steve has got a question. He'll finish us off. Steve, why don't you unmute and ask, and then we'll conclude for the day.
Don't put that much pressure on me, Marty. Dr. Chachanov, I was first exposed to you when I read about dignity therapy during palliative fellowship training, and I hope and that was very influential on the way I think about taking care of patients and families. Hope this isn't too big a question to end with, but what advice would you have for people completing medical school at this point?
For people completing medical school, again, I guess I would. You hear it often said that medical school often causes a deterioration of kind of the human instincts, or the empathic instincts that people come into medical school with. And I would say that, if people find that they're becoming sort of so objective in their outlook that they're becoming, they feel disengaged from, the emotional experiences that people are having, or from the human side of medicine, to try and reconnect with that, because that is going to make them more successful in their practice. It's going to make for a more satisfying medical practice, and it's going to make for more satisfied patients and family members. I remember I just published a book called Dignity and Care, the Human Side of Medicine. And I've interviewed a number of key informants, wonderful colleagues who I figured, had some pearls of wisdom to share. And I remember I interviewed a neurosurgeon who's had a stellar career. I mean, he's just been just an extraordinary, not only local leader, but being a national and international leader in the field. And he talked about how he would always sit with his patients and their families and take the time to answer every question until there was nothing left for them to ask. And I said, well, how do you do that? I mean, you're as busy as every neurosurgeon that I've met. So how do you do that? And he said something to the effect, if you don't do it, patients and families are less prepared. And if you avoid those questions, you spend the entirety of your career feeling like you're chased. So I would remind medical students that, this is not only a kind way of being or a compassionate way of being. This is going to give them a career that is going to be imminently more satisfying than if they feel that the only approach to their success is by somehow find ways of disengaging from the human drama that is the practice of medicine. And I see somebody in the chat was asking about an email address, and because I know we're running out of time, although I'm not in a rush, I'm certainly happy to answer a few more questions if there is time. But my email address is Harvey, HARVEY .Chochinov, CHOCHINOV @cancercare, all one word, .M as in Michael, B as in Bobby, .ca. And happy for you to send me any questions, and I will certainly respond to them in due course.
Lovely. Thank you, Harvey. We are so appreciative of your time today. It meant a lot.
Oh, well, my pleasure. It was fun.
Good. I'm glad. All right. Have a great weekend, everybody.
Yeah, take care.
Bye.